Hello students, today I am going to discuss an important chapter from your grammar book, that is Verbs voice. From this lesson, you will be able to learn about voice, its type means active and passive voice, when to use active and passive voice, and how to convert sentences from active to passive. So without further delay, let's get started. What is voice? The voice of a verb tells whether the subject is doing something or something is being done to him. That means the voice of a verb describes the relationship between the action that the verb expresses and the participants identified by its arguments. There are two voices, active voice and passive voice. Now let's understand what is active voice. A verb is in the active voice when its form shows that the person or thing denoted by the subject does something or is the doer of the action. That means in active voice, the subject is doing the action while the object is one receiving the action. Look at these examples. Rahul writes a letter. She sings a song. These examples show that the subject is doing the verb's action. Here in the first sentence, the verb writes shows that the subject Rahul does something. So the verb write is said to be in the active voice. Active voice is considered to be the normal form of sentence. Active voice generally follows the pattern like this: subject or the doer of the action plus the verb plus the object, means this is the receiver of the action. Subject plus verb plus object. Now let's learn the uses of active voice. When more clarity or straightforward relation is required between the verb and the subject, we are going to use the active voice. Now let's understand what is passive voice. If the subject is having the action done to it, then the verb is said to be in the passive voice. That means the subject of the sentence is being acted upon. The subject is not performing the action, it received the action. Then only the verb is said to be in the passive voice. Look at these examples. A letter is written by Rahul. A song is sung by her. Here in these sentences you can see that the subject is no longer active, but it is being acted upon by the verb. Means the subject receives the action expressed by the verb. So the verb in these sentences is said to be in the passive voice. In the passive sentence, object takes the place of subject and the subject takes the place of object, and with by being added to it. So the structure of this sentence is like object, then be verb, then third form of verb means past participle, then by, then the subject. Now let's understand when to use the passive voice. Generally we are using the active voice only, but when to use passive voice? When the action is the focus, not the subject. And another one case is when the doer is unknown. That time we are going to use passive voice. Let's quickly revise what have we learned. First we have learned what is voice. Voice is the quality of a verb that indicates whether its subject acts or is acted upon. Then we have learned what is active and passive voice. if the subject is doing the action, then the verb is said to be in the active voice. And if the subject of the sentence is being acted upon, then the verb is said to be in the passive voice. Another thing we have learned, that is the uses of active and passive voice. When more clarity and straightforward relation is required between the verb and subject, that time we have to use active voice. And when the action is the focus, not the subject, and when the doer is unknown, that time we are going to use the passive voice. And we have learned the structure of active and passive voice. In the active voice, the sentence structure is straightforward: subject, then verb, then object. And the sentence structure of the passive voice is object, then helping verb, then past participle of the main verb, then by, then the subject. This is the basic simple structure we need to follow. Now we are going to discuss the rules to change the sentences from active to passive voice. First thing you have to follow, that is the object in the active voice becomes the subject in the passive voice. The subject in the active voice is changed into the object in the passive voice, and it generally takes the preposition by before it. Next rule, the verb in the active voice is changed into the past participle in the passive voice, and it takes the verb to be in one of its forms depending upon the tense of the active voice. In the active voice, if the subject is a pronoun and we are going to change this subject into an object in the passive voice, then I becomes me, he becomes him, she becomes her, we becomes us, and they becomes them, and you and it remains the same. We have to remember it properly. The rules for using auxiliary verb in the passive sentences are different for each tense, which you need to learn. For present indefinite tense, is, am, are. Present continuous tense, is being, am being, are being. Present perfect tense, has been or have been. Past indefinite, was, were. Past continuous tense, was being, were being. Past perfect tense, had been. Future indefinite tense, will be, shall be. Future perfect tense, will have been. So this is the rules for using the auxiliary verb in the passive sentence. Another thing you have to note, that there is no passive form of verb in the present perfect continuous tense, past perfect continuous tense, future perfect continuous tense, and future continuous tense. Another thing you have to note, that only transitive verbs can be used in the passive voice. Intransitive verb cannot be changed into the passive voice. Now let's learn how to change sentences from active to passive voice in different tenses. First, we see the example of simple present tense. The active sentence is, he writes a letter. So here we need to first identify the subject, verb, and the object. So here in this sentence, the subject is he, and the verb is write, and a letter is the object. So according to the rule, the places of subject and object will be interchanged in the passive sentence. Next, auxiliary verb used in the passive voice. Third form of verb will be used in the passive voice. Then we need to use the preposition by before the object. So the passive sentence will be, a letter is written by him. The structure of passive sentence for this tense is subject plus amizer, past participle of verb plus by, then object. Hope all of you understood. Next, we see the example of present continuous tense. Active sentences, they are eating mangoes. Here also, we have to interchange the places of subject and object in the passive sentence. Then we need to use the auxiliary verb is being or are being. Next, we need to use the past participle. Then we need to use the preposition by, and we have to write at last the object. So the passive sentence will be mangoes are being eaten by them. And the structure of the passive sentence for this tense is subject, then amizer plus being, third form of verb by, and at last object. Next, we see the example of present perfect tense. The active sentence is Rohit has painted the picture. First, we need to interchange the places of subject and object. Next, we need to use the auxiliary verb have or has. Then we have to add been. Then third form of verb. Then we need to use the preposition by, and at last object. So the passive sentence is the picture has been painted by Rohit. So the structure of the passive sentence for this tense is subject, have, has, been, third form of verb by plus object. Next, you see the example of simple past tense. The active sentence is I saw the tiger. We need to change it into passive sentence. First, the places of subject and object will be interchanged. Then auxiliary verb used here was or were. Third form of verb we need to use. Then we need to use the preposition by, and at last object. So the passive sentence will be the tiger was seen by me. And the structure of the passive sentence for this tense is subject plus was were, the past participle of the verb, then by plus object. Next example is for past progressive. The active sentence is we were reading a book. So according to the rule, we need to interchange the places of subject and object. Then we need to write the auxiliary verb was being or were being. Then need to add the past participle of the verb, then use the preposition by, then the object. So the passive sentence will be a book was being read by us. And the structure of the passive sentence for this tense is subject was were plus being, past participle of the verb by, then the object. Next example, past perfect tense. The active sentence is she had already done the work. First, we need to interchange the places of subject and object. Next, we need to add the auxiliary verb had been, then the past participle of the verb, then we need to use by before the object. So the passive sentence will be the work had already been done by her. And the structure of the passive sentence for this tense is subject, then had been, past participle of the verb, then by, and at last object. Next example is for simple future tense. Active sentence is Radha will sing a song. So according to the rule, the places of subject and object will be interchanged in the passive voice. Then we need to add the auxiliary verb shall be or will be. Then third form of verb will be used in the passive voice, and we need to use the preposition by before the object. So the passive sentence will be a song will be sung by Radha. The structure of the passive sentence for this tense is subject, shall be or will be, past participle of the verb, by, then object. And the last, future perfect tense. The active sentence is he will have read the book. So first we need to interchange the places of subject and object. Then we need to use the auxiliary verb shall, will, then have, then been. Then we need to use the past participle verb in the passive voice, and we need to use the preposition by before the object. So the passive sentence will be the book will have been read by him. And the structure of the passive sentence for this tense is subject, shall, will, have been, past participle of verb, by, then object. So that's all for this lesson. This is a very important chapter, so go through the chapter properly. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.